Greetings, everyone. I'm Ed Langle. I'm Senior Director of Programs at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to what promises to be a great program on the history of African Americans in combat in the United States from World War I to World War II, with everything in between and in the immediate post-World War II years. And I'm joined by three of our nation's preeminent scholars on that subject. Our host is Dr. John Morrow, who is Franklin Professor of History at the University of Georgia, and who is co-author with our second panelist, Dr. Jeffrey Sammons, who's Professor of History at New York University, of Harlem's Rattlers and the Great War, which I can say personally is a fantastic book about one of the preeminent African-American units in the First World War. And our third panelist is Dr. Robert Jefferson, Jr., who is Associate Professor of History at the University of New Mexico and author of Fighting for Hope, African Americans and the 93rd Infantry Division in World War II. So I'll turn it over to Dr. John Morrow.
Thanks very much, Ed. Welcome today to the National World War II Museum's webinar on African American soldiers in combat in the World Wars. As Ed introduced me, my name is John Morrow. I'll be your moderator, and our two panelists, Jeffrey Sammons from NYU, will concentrate on the First World War, and Professor Robert Jefferson of the University of New Mexico will concentrate on the Second World War today. Now I'd like to begin by quickly introducing you to the context of the times in which these men served and fought. The World Wars occurred during the reign of white supremacy in the United States, rigid segregation as well. And African Americans literally had no rights that white Americans were bound to respect. The years were dotted with lynchings and race riots, the latter of which often, in fact, boiled down to being white massacres of Black people. To be a Black person, and consequently a Black man in the military, meant the odds were stacked against you, although African Americans had served in combat in all the wars that the American colonies and the United States had waged. The Navy had relegated all Black sailors to menial and positions of servitude, menial duties and positions of servitude, World War I and World War II until the very end of World War II, although Black sailors had served as full-fledged seamen throughout the 19th century. And the Marines, who had been decreed to be all white by proclamation in 1798, only allowed Black Marines in World War II to perform logistical and supply duties. So the focus today actually ends up on the U.S. Army. But in the U.S. Army, white Southerners set the tone for the treatment of African American soldiers in both wars. And you might ask, why? Because the Army, reflecting the claims of Southern politicians and officers, believed that Southern officers, quote, understood, end of quote, Black men better than other whites. But understood meant that they presumed Black men lacked the courage, initiative, and intelligence to be combat soldiers, much less officers, and heaven forbid, certainly not pilots of combat planes And so what you had was this array of prejudices ranged against you. This presumption that white Southern officers should lead black men meant that most black soldiers were condemned to the command of the most prejudiced officers in the U.S. Army, with some exceptions, but by and large, this was the case. And this went from division commanders all the way down to company commanders, and I would include the top brass of the U.S. Army in the men of whose attitudes denigrated the potential of black men for combat. These were officers who did not hesitate to call their men directly the N-word, which I'm using today because high school students might end up seeing this, a boy, and denigrated and outright lied about their black subordinates' abilities and achievements in order to portray them often as cowards and criminals. Although black soldiers fought well in World War I, as Professor Sammons will show, the same racist conditions and attitudes prevailed in the Second World War. That is why World War II became, for African Americans, a struggle for double victory. Victory over fascism abroad and racism at home. As we return now with my two colleagues to the first half of the 19th century, ask yourself, why did African American soldiers who went to fight and die for their country have to serve under such abysmal circumstances? Occasionally, individuals refer to this situation as sad. I've heard that term used. It was not sad. It was tragic. And this treatment occurred deliberately and purposely because what was at stake was equal rights for Black Americans in the United States. This is a story of tragedy and ultimate triumph, won against the odds and at the sacrifice of the blood of Black Americans in the service of their country. It's my pleasure now to turn the program over to Professor Sammons first and then to Professor Jefferson. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Morrow. And Blacks knew all too well this history of denigration and disparagement. Spencer Carpenter, a AME pastor, wrote in 1913, "As a soldier, the American Negro equals any soldier in the world. And this fact will be admitted by an unbiased historian or student of this world's events in time of peace or war. As a race, we have every reason to be proud of our contribution to this government in its times of war. But above that, we can boast that among our troops, not in a single case is there on record any knowledge of cowardice, nor one case in which a Negro soldier failed to do his full duty. Yet in spite of these facts, in spite of the glorious record of our troops in the American wars, there are those who insist that the Negro has no flag. He has a flag. He fought for it in 1775, in 1812, in 1863, and in 1898. He who says we have no flag denies the valor and patriotism of thousands of Negroes who on hundreds of battlefields have proved their worth as soldiers and as men." And Carpenter predicted that if Blacks soldiers were not treated properly, that there would be a bloody uprising unparalleled in the history of the world. And in some respects, that came to fruition in the summer of 1919 as Chicago, Washington, Omaha, and in 1921, we've heard so much about Tulsa, actually occurred, along with 21 other cities and towns that erupted in racial violence, resulting in the loss of hundreds of lives. In 1863, of course, Frederick Douglass pressed hard for the inclusion of Black troops in the war to end slavery, and goaded Lincoln, actually told him that he was fighting with a soft white hand, or had the black hand tied behind its back, and he needed to use the iron fist of the black man to defeat the Confederacy. And Paul Laurence Dunbar, commenting on Blacks in the Civil War, writes, "In the early days you scorned them, then distress fell on the nation, and the flag was drooping low. Should the dust pollute your banner? No, the nation shouted no. So when war and savage triumph spread abroad his funeral pall, then you called the colored soldiers, and they answered to your call." And that's been repeated throughout the history of America, that only in cases of emergency or desperation or in exigency has the Black soldier been used and then discarded like worn tissues or used tissues afterward. So why would Blacks continue to press for service in the military? Blacks understood the importance of the military to the American psyche, to its actual existence. Remember, Crispus Attucks is considered to be the first Black to have died in the Revolutionary War. Although the Boston Massacre took place in 1770, it was in many ways seen as the first blow against British occupation and tyranny. So why would Blacks continue to press for service? Because they realized that, one, fighting in battle can bring freedom, but it also can bring respect. And if not seen by whites, it's certainly seen by other Blacks. William Pickens, moving on to World War I, tells us why the Black fought in World War I, and that is that Blacks were able to establish their character as opposed to reputation, which is given to someone by others. Character is intrinsic. And he says that the character of Black Americans shone clearly in the light of war, caused by the all-exposing fires of a burning world. Suddenly, the most undesirable element in the United States became the most reliable element, as symbolized and recognized by the calling out of President Wilson of Black National Guard troops to protect the White House. That the war had allowed Blacks from Africa and America the opportunity to make the first great record as a modern international factor and a positive world influence was a lesson never to be lost on Blacks. World War I helped to produce a self-confident new Negro, and all the change that came later owes much to the forward-looking and forward-moving people of that time. And World War I has been written off as a lost cause in which Blacks fought blindly for nothing, to be treated in the same way that they had before the war, after the war. This could not be farther than from the truth. As Blacks in World War I laid the foundation for what would happen in the interwar period and what would happen in World War II. And once again, I want to emphasize the point, for especially for students, that what is really important about these events and experiences is the effect that they have on Blacks themselves and what Blacks internalize from them, and not what others might represent them to be. So what happened in World War I? And I want to use the 369th, which was the 15th New York National Guard and the first Black National Guard unit in New York State, not established until 1916, as a case study for the Black experience in World War I. It certainly is representative in many respects, but also different, and different for very important reasons. So after a prolonged struggle to become recognized as a National Guard unit, this happens, as I indicated, in 1916. And the unit will go on to serve in combat, but with the French army. And this is one of the important distinctions between the 15th New York National Guard, the 369th Regiment, and other African-American troops. Also the fact that they were a National Guard unit and did not, at least at the beginning of their experience in combat, have those Southern officers that Professor Morrow has referred to. Most of the officers came from the Northeast, and especially New York. And this made an important difference too. But their positioning with the French was extremely important. And they also had 5 Black officers with the regiment, 4 of them who were actually combat officers. In the middle of the war, actually, they would be removed for reasons that I can't get into now, except there was a movement by General Pershing to not have any Black officers actually be in a position to command white officers who would be inserted, and many of them replacement officers, and some of them from the South. And this brings me to an important point about Blacks as officers. And when that disparagement and denigration occurs after the war, or even during it, but certainly after, led by Colonel Alan Greer, who was the Chief of Staff of the 92nd Division, also by Robert E. Lee Bullard, who was from Alabama, commanded Black troops in the Spanish-American War. I can tell you that familiarity did breed contempt in his mind about the Black soldier. He would lead this campaign to disparage the Black soldier, which would be picked up later in an official report that I'll refer to at the end of my talk, the Army War College study of 1925. But I want to say something about Black officers, and let's point to the nation's leading military academy. The first Black graduate of the United States Military Academy was Henry Ossian Flipper. That happened in 1877, so in Reconstruction. The second was John Hanks Alexander in 1887. And the third was Charles Young. And we have an image of Charles Young, who actually should have become the first Black general in the United States military. But after he had reached the rank of colonel, was determined to have been unfit physically to continue in active service. And this came out of a complaint by a white Southern lieutenant who served under Young in the 9th Cavalry, and was picked up by a United States senator from Mississippi, and actually forced Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of War to inactivate Young. So Young is on the right, prematurely aged because of the way he was treated. Interestingly, Young tried to prove his fitness for service by taking a horse from Ohio to Washington, D.C. Not only did he ride it, he walked the horse a part of the way in order to rest the horse. And when he arrived, the military officials said, "You've only proven the fitness of the horse, not of yourself." Interestingly, after the war, Young was reinstated, sent to Africa, and died of a tropical fever. So it was clear that this man was removed from service because the United States was not ready for a Black general. And this takes me back to something else that occurred after the Civil War that is very important for us to understand, and that is the origins of the segregated army. Now, we know that there were Black units in the Civil War, most notably the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and then its brother or sister organization, the 55th. But actually, in 1866, the United States government passed a law establishing the segregated army in law. And out of that came the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. And a white captain, graduate of West Point from Alabama, Matthew Steele, in 1911 said that this was a worse act than anything he saw in the laws of Mississippi and Alabama at the time in terms of solidifying second-class citizenship for Blacks. And why was that done? In my opinion, it was done because to have integrated the United States military would have been an act of social equality, which even the most enlightened advocates of Black rights did not support. So here we have something that, as Professor Jefferson will show us, that will last until the Korean War, the segregated United States Army. So the 369th fights with the French, is sent to the front 1 month after 1 month of training. That unit will receive a regimental croix de guerre, and 174 individuals would also receive that honor. And one of the greatest heroes of World War I, who has only recently received the recognition that he deserved, is Henry Johnson. And we have a slide, actually a couple of slides of Henry Johnson. He is the figure at the bottom of the page on the right side. Henry Johnson received the Croix de Guerre with Palm, which is the highest level at which that award is bestowed. It's by order of the Army. And Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts fought off a German raiding party, estimated to be a number of 24, and fought them with grenades, with rifle, with bayonet, with bolo knife, and both men almost died in the process. Henry Johnson would not receive an American honor until 1994, and that was the Purple Heart. He received the Distinguished Service Cross in 2003, but there had been a campaign for Henry Johnson to receive the Medal of Honor from the 1980s. And it wasn't until 2015, under the Obama administration, that Henry Johnson received the honor that he should have. And Henry is not alone for not being recognized as one should. And in fact, there were some 70 Black recipients of the Distinguished Service Cross, and recent research conducted by me has found that there were at least a total of 8 recommended for the Medal of Honor, and all of them were denied by General Pershing personally, except for Freddie Stowers, whose case slipped through the cracks. And in 1991, Freddie Stowers became the first Black to receive the Medal of Honor from World War I. I want to mention that there's now a project that is based at Park University in Parkville, Missouri, at the Robb Center for the Study of the Great War, that is attempting to do a systematic review of Black soldiers in World War I for consideration for the Medal of Honor. I would like to move on to the fact that despite the record that the 369th men and others as well, not all these men were from the 369th. William Butler is another hero of the 369th who was actually recommended for a Medal of Honor, but so were 7 others, some from the 92nd Division. I'd like to move, and we see this rendering of Henry Johnson, who looks quite different than the Henry Johnson that we saw in the photograph. But also here we have a poem that is a riff on John McCrae's Flanders Fields that hopes that the Black sacrificed in World War I will not be in vain. And I'd like to move on, and I'll talk over the next, which is actually a video of the March of the 369th on February 17, 1919, up 5th Avenue, which David Levering Lewis claims is the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. And what an impressive and imposing sight of these men marching in French formation, 16 apart. And despite their heroics and the heroics of other Blacks in World War I, the Army War College basically took what people like Greer and Bullard had stated and made it official policy, formalized it. Compared to the white man, he is admittedly, and that he is a Black soldier of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character. The Negro, particularly the officer, failed in the World War. And basically they said that what he was really good for was menial tasks and service operations, that the Negro officers under Negro officers, Black soldiers displayed ineptitude for modern battle. Their natural racial characteristics, lack of initiative, and tendency to become panic-stricken can only be overcome when they have confidence in their leaders. And of course, those leaders were supposed to be white officers, and especially white Southern officers. So we see this parade, this impressive display of Black discipline, and it's once lauded, but also seen as a threat. What will these men do in terms of the status quo ante? And maybe not so much in the case of the 369th, but in the case of others who, especially those who were treated less well than members of the 369th, they became sort of the vanguard of a sort of Black militancy and the new Negro movement post-war. So we see that formation of 16 across, which is a French formation, never before seen in the United States. And we're going to move up on, and I'll end my talk with your being able to see Henry Johnson, who was clearly the hero of the moment in this tremendous display of Black discipline and unity. And I think he's coming soon. He's in a car, as Henry had been wounded in the foot, leg in that episode. Here we are. So that is Henry Johnson, acknowledging the crowd. So that ends my presentation. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Robert, the game goes to you.
Okay, I want to thank you, Professor Morrow, and also the National World War II Museum for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I want to follow up with Professor Sammons' insightful discussion of African Americans in the First World War by offering the theme, basically, that I think really that shapes the combat record of African American World War II soldiers. And that is the theme that it reflected the fact that they were asked to pay a price for all who basically lived under the threat of racism at home while they were fighting against Nazism and also fascism abroad. Now, let me outline the parameters of my talk. First, what I want to do is to give you a broad overview of the African American combat performance in World War II. Then I want to briefly talk about their performances under fire in Europe and the Pacific. Then I want to offer some closing remarks about what I think is the legacy of the Black soldier in World War II for consideration. And I think this is particularly striking in light of what Professor Sammons talked about basically the plight of African Americans in the First World War, because much of this sort of seems like a broken record, but then again, it's not. So let me offer this, let me indulge you for a second by offering you a vignette. And that is this: in studying the Black combat experience in World War II, I'm reminded of the words of British military historian Sir John Keegan. In a noteworthy book that was published in 1976, Keegan stated, quote, "I have not been in a battle, not near one, nor heard of one from afar, nor seen the aftermath," in close quote. Keegan basically wrote in this book, influential book, about his struggles to understand the face of battle at Agincourt, basically Waterloo, and the Somme. But he always used that statement as a badge of humility when he was writing about those soldiers. And likewise, I've tried to basically adopt a similar approach when talking to basically Black veterans, Black World War II veterans, also walking the battlefields on which they basically served with valor, also turning up relics of war, and then also studying the photographs and paintings depicting World War II in order to better understand what battle basically seemed like for them. So with that said, I think I want to open with the African American combat experience in World War II can be divided into two distinct sub-themes. The first one is very much similar to what Professor Sammons talked about in his talk, and that is the fight for the right to fight. And hence basically the fight for racial equality at home. Because I think a lot of what basically the Black World War II soldier experienced while training stateside was deeply basically wrapped up and enveloped in this fight for racial equality. And then the second sub-theme is basically the double victory strategies against Nazism and fascism in Europe and Asia. And I think when you think about this, for them, this battle for them, they saw Nazism, fascism, racism as two sides of the same coin. So let me start off with basically the fight for the right to fight, and then just to give you a broad overview of the African-American overseas deployment. At most, almost 20% of the total 1.5 million African-American GIs in the United States Armed Forces were stationed abroad basically during the war. The thing is to remember about this war is that African Americans at the very outset of the war were clamoring for the right to participate fully in the war effort. And they basically fought on a number of fronts. Basically, you had organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and also newspapers, Black weeklies like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender that were clamoring and pushing for basically the Roosevelt administration to basically to include African Americans in this fight that they saw coming. Meanwhile, basically, the War Department and also Roosevelt officials, realizing fully that African Americans, as American citizens, should be allowed to participate fully in this in the war and in the fight, they had to develop plans for them to do so, and they did this under a number of protective mobilization plans. First, in the 1930s, with basically the 1937 basically plan, which talked about African Americans would constitute its percentage in the general population in the war effort, any future war. The second thing was that they also offered a very abysmal assessment of basically the Black servicemen and also officers. And all of that was derived, as Professor Sammons talked about, from the First World War, their performance in the First World War, that assessment. Those plans basically followed Black soldiers who served in World War II from the moment they basically entered the US Armed Forces to the time that they were deployed overseas. Now, the other thing is, once basically African Americans were allowed or permitted to basically serve, and they were basically being drafted and inducted in large numbers, there was this push to find places to deploy them overseas. During this time, basically from early 1942 through 1945, foreign governments and also officials in places like Australia, Greenland, Iceland, China, Liberia, Great Britain, and also the West Indies advised the War Department against sending Black soldiers to their countries. And what they used as a way of justifying this was they cited the antagonistic attitudes of its local white populations to the presence of Black soldiers. And also, to make matters worse, Army authorities also, as if this was not enough, they alluded to erroneous myths of extreme temperatures in order to block basically Black anti-aircraft troops from entering northern territories such as Alaska and also northwestern Canada. A lot of these myths were deeply grounded in racist, basically, determinations that go all the way back to the early 19th century. But with that, all of that said, the African-American GIs, they were basically deployed basically almost at the beginning of the war. They made a tremendous contribution to the fighting of the war itself. During the Japanese, for instance, during the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Dory Miller, who was a messman from Waco, Texas, he dramatically answered the call to duty when his ship, the USS West Virginia, drew enemy fire. During the hours of intense fighting, Miller basically carried his wounded captain to safety before basically manning a machine gun himself, downing several Japanese aircraft. And for his efforts, basically, Miller was awarded the Navy Cross. So we see that basically African Americans, when they are presented with these moments of intense, basically an intense anxiety that's brought about by war and also battle, they are performing quite well. So let me move on to talk about basically the double victory strategies that they devised in Europe. Because this was something that really was exhibited, I think, on a large scale, particularly in the very outset of, for instance, the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944. In June of 1944, members of the all-Black 330th anti-aircraft basically participated in the D-Day landings in Normandy, providing cover basically from German planes, allowing invading troops and service and supply forces to wade ashore. Their efforts helped to launch the Allied invasion to recapture Nazi-occupied France. Quite often, and until recently, we really don't know the story about basically of these members who served with this anti-aircraft basically unit. And it often gets washed, basically, it gets washed over. I think we would do well to pay very careful attention to them, because it was in that intense battle that they basically started to devise and start to think about what this war was going to mean for them. Then also that's followed up with basically the exploits of the Red Ball Express, and this basically this Red Ball Express were black truckers with the Army Transportation Corps. And they were convoys that moved tons of supplies from basically the coast of Paris to various points of the European theater of operations. These black truck companies basically drove nonstop, delivering more than 400,000 tons of valuable supplies to armies at the front, and they earned the praise of their superior officers. But then also along with them basically was the 761st Tank Battalion, basically the Black Panther Battalion, as they were nicknamed. Among the 22 basically black combat units that saw heavy action in the European theater was this battalion. It was attached to George Patton's Third Army. They landed in Normandy and took part in many pitched battles throughout France, Belgium, Holland, as well as well into Germany. This group would perform so well, basically, that they would receive a presidential citation after the war, and one of its members, basically Sergeant Reuben Rivers from Oklahoma, will be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. And more about the Medal of Honor recipients later, because I think it's about this broader, basically, discussion of the legacy of the World War II soldiers. And then finally, I have a photograph of the 332nd Fighter Group. And with that photograph, you can see here, thank you. Basically, you see the pilots there basically kneeling in southern Italy in 1944. These pilots were a part of they were along with the 99th Pursuit Squadron, also later the 477 Bombardment Group. They performed with great distinction. They escorted scores of Allied bombers on hundreds of missions. In combat, the P-40 Warhawks, which is the plane that you see in your background there, was manned by these Tuskegee Airmen who flew over 1,500 missions and also basically provided 15,000 sorties, and were credited with basically having never lost a bomber under their protection to enemy aircraft. So in accordance to their deeds of valor, individual airmen basically received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Legion of Merit, and also the Silver and Bronze Star. And they also earned the adulation of military brass, the public, and also pundits alike. And in fact, we see them even in our times now, basically being deeply revered in American society. But then that moves me on to basically the Mediterranean and foot soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, which I have another slide. This slide happens to be like one of my favorite slides out of this grouping, because in this, you see them there basically going out on patrol. The way patrols were basically during this time was that you would have basically platoons receiving they would receive their reports, the operations reports at the beginning of the day. They would also basically see exactly where the units would be adjacent on the battlefield and sand tables that were provided at the time. If there were officers, they would basically give these orders to the men who stood in the ranks. For those who were in the ranks would basically receive the orders and where their units would be deployed. And then they would basically carry out the operation. And then all of that, if all went well, basically they would report back to the home base, in which they would give after action reports. This group right here, you see them there in northern Italy. They were part of they were also a part of the Allied offensive during that period. Many of them basically faced tremendous fire from enemy forces who were allied along the Gothic line, which was this heavily fortified enemy position, in which you had enemy snipers and also basically fortified positions in which they could see troops moving, and they would pick them off at a moment's notice. It was not uncommon, as I talked to several of these individuals who served in this unit, to talk about how at one moment they would be standing next to someone, the next moment they would see that person basically being killed right before them, and it left an indelible impression in their minds. during the campaign during this time, the 92nd, which what these guys represented, and by the way, look at the unit insignia basically on their shoulders there. Those unit insignias are basically represent the Buffalo Soldiers going all the way back to the 19th century, in which they saw themselves as a part of a lineage of proud soldiers that were fighting during this period. And I'm sure Professor Sammons would attest to that. That was that lineage that they carried forward. It was a badge of honor. It was a badge of courage. But this unit that these individuals were a part of, they suffered basically nearly 300 casualties, including over 220 men wounded and nearly 70 who were killed in action. But they would earn basically the respect of senior Army leaders, with 7 of their men basically distinguishing themselves on the field of battle and also earning the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Some of them, for instance, Vernon Baker, was basically awarded the Medal of Honor in 1997, but it would take a long time in coming for his record to come forward because he was one of the most distinguished African-American soldiers who served in this war. Now I'd like to go on to talk about basically strategies in the Pacific. And just briefly about the 24th Infantry Regiment, which basically was there at the very beginning of the Allied basically advance throughout the Pacific. They fought alongside of the 14th Corps in the South Pacific. They were basically in Guadalcanal for almost a 3-year period. And they performed basic service duties such as loading and unloading ships, building roads, and also sustaining wire communications while they defended the perimeter against enemy attack. Now, these service duties that I'm describing for you were not as straightforward as they would seem. And what I learned this from my own research was that quite often what these individuals would end up doing was they would be basically unloading these ships, basically loading and unloading ships and garrison duties at the same time they were being exposed to enemy fire. So they were also carrying out basically patrols in the jungles and so forth. And then at the same time, they were basically performing these duties, which made it very difficult for them. The picture that I have for you there with the individuals, with the servicemen basically in New Guinea, are members of the U.S. 93rd Infantry Division. Now these combat troops, they perform these jungle patrols on a daily basis. They were there in the South Pacific, but they also moved along, basically up the chain, the Pacific Island chain towards Japan, where they would be used in order to, in basically what were considered to be very intricate operations against the enemy, trying to basically draw the enemy out into the open in order to destroy them. But then now I want to move on to talk about World War II and the legacy of, basically the post-war legacy of African-American troops. I think their legacy is quite mixed because one, in the aftermath of the war, basically the War Department put together a board of senior officers to assess the performance capabilities of African-Americans in the Second World War. And this board of Army officers basically reviewed the use of Black troops during the war. They also questioned the basically 60 senior officers who commanded Black troops. And also they studied the after-action reports that were filed about basically the segregated units during the war itself. Now the results were hardly surprising. The senior officers tended to disparage the combat capabilities of Black servicemen and officers, very much similar to what you see in the aftermath of World War I. They used language like, for instance, the officers basically were deeply resented by the soldiers that they commanded. 2, that they could not understand basically the types of commands that were given to them in order to carry out basically the intricate operations that they were given. And 3, that they were not capable basically of basically assessing the performance of the soldiers that were under them. The board basically, at the same time, they acknowledged the Army's obligation to provide the nation with the most efficient manpower, but similar to their World War I predecessors, they avoided abolishing segregation, and they recommended attaching all Black units, like battalions, to larger white elements. Now, while this this board that met, they released their findings in 1946, and basically it met a lot of criticism. It also, their findings also paved the way for President Harry S. Truman's 1948 executive order that calling for the desegregation of the armed forces. But the thing to remember about this, and for all those students out there, is that basically President Truman's executive order, which is 9981, would not take place until the latter stages of the Korean War. And it would be the hard and bitter lessons of the battles that were fought at the beginning of that war that would lead basically Army senior command to realize that they were not making efficient use of the manpower available to them. Now, the last thing I want to add with this is the legacy of the Black combat soldier of World War II would be rehabilitated somewhat, but by basically the awarding of the Medal of Honor to 7 individuals who served in World War II. To the left there, you see basically the picture of Vernon Baker. Baker, as I said before, is like one of the most celebrated African-American soldiers from that wartime era. The one in the middle is Edward Carter Jr., who is somebody who served in he is very interesting because he served in the Spanish Civil War, basically before the beginning of World War II, and he goes on basically to serve in Europe, basically with U.S. forces. And he has a very colorful life after the war. And then the third person there, John R. Fox. Fox served along with basically Baker in the 92nd Infantry Division. He was a Fort observer for one of the units, and he happened to basically, finding himself surrounded by the enemy, called basically indirect fire on his own position in order to save his men. So with that, basically we see at the end of the war, it would take some 50 years into the future before basically members of the public, as well as the congressional basically leadership, and then also the Defense Department, to realize that these individuals had served with great valor. And I think what would happen as a result of this, as the Defense Department and also future administrations go back and revisit the combat records of these other Black GIs, the record of the Black soldier in World War II will be amended to include other Medal of Honor recipients coming from this generation. And at that, it's also going to force a revision of an entire revision of the Black experience in the war altogether. So I want to summarize and just wrap this up. Like previous wars basically fought earlier in the 20th century, the lessons of World War II and also the combat record of the Black soldiers have taken place on America's tortured basically path towards racial equality. However, as the face of battle changes, new criteria will be developed to determine how to assess combat basically under fire during this period as well. And with that, we can point to new sites where valor can be better understood. I think the Black combat experience in World War II provides just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Those were marvelous presentations. Before I turn it over to Ed Lengel for the question and answer period, I just have a minor correction that has to do with the viewing public at the National World War II Museum, which I have dealt with in the past. Professor Jefferson, when you looked at that photo of the airplane behind the Tuskegee Airmen, you happened to say it was a P-40. It's a P-51C. This is a minor correction, but let me tell you, I have worked with the museum before, and there are aero nuts out there. And if you can't, they're going to look at that and they're going to say, aha. But I just wanted to mention that because that's a P-51C. They ultimately flew the late Model D version, but you can tell it's a C because it's only got twin 50 calibers in each wing. That's what they flew escort in. And then at the end of the war, they had the P-51D, which had 350 caliber machine guns. So a minor correction, but those were absolutely excellent presentations. Thank you, gentlemen. Ed, it's all yours.
Right. Thanks, all of you. Again, fantastic presentations, and we're getting quite a few great questions from the audience as well. So I want to go straight to those. Professor Sammons, we'll start with you. I know you've answered some of these directly online, but there was one question in particular perhaps you could share with the rest of the audience. One of our audience members asked if all African Americans in World War I served with the French, and of course that's not true. Could you please contrast the experiences of the 92nd and the 93rd Divisions in that war?
Thank you very much for that question. The 93rd Division was a division only on paper. It was known as a provisional division. It had 4 regiments, the 369th, the 370th, the 371st, and the 372nd. The 369th and 370th were all National Guard units. And in fact, the 370th had been the 8th Illinois, which had been officered by blacks from the bottom, from the top down. And the commander of that unit was removed once again for health reasons, end quote, during the war. Pershing sent in a Major Thomas Roberts, who became a colonel, to lead that regiment, but it kept its majority black officer corps. The 371st was regular Army from South Carolina, and that included Freddie Stowers, as well as Burton Holmes, who was also nominated for Medal of Honor. And the 372nd was a sort of a combination of National Guard units and some regular Army. The 92nd Division was all regular Army. It had some black officers, but no black officer would be at a rank over or have a line authority over any white officer. General Ballou, who issued the infamous order preventing blacks from going to movie theaters in the towns in the United States, was the commander of the 92nd Division. It was Alan Greer, who was his chief of staff, who said that the black soldier was only capable of fighting women, white women and children, that they were basically rapists and cowards, came out of that unit as well. And of course, there's the 368th Regiment, which was set up for failure by white officers who did not even give them wire cutters to go out into patrol operations. So the treatment of the units in the by the white officers in the 92nd Division was pretty horrendous across the board. I wanted to make one point, though, that I didn't and should have after the parade, to indicate, and to the Army War College report, that the 369th was decommissioned right after that parade. There was no more 369th. There was no more 370th after 1919. And this was part of an attempt by the military to remove the black from combat service. And it wasn't until 1924 that the 369th and 370th were recommissioned. I also want to point one other thing out about the ghoulish and ghastly assignments that blacks had in World War I. Most of them, there were only 40,000 black combat troops out of 200,000 who went over. The other 200,000 essentially stayed as forced laborers in camps stateside. And that the worst, you know, we think of sanitation as being really bad and all that, and blacks were assigned to that service, supply of service troops. But the worst were the graves registration men. They had to disinter the bodies of fallen soldiers and identify them, and then either move them for shipment home or to have them buried in American graves in France. This was and Belgium. This was a horrible, horrible assignment that blacks were given.
Thank you for sharing that. We've got another question also for you, Professor Sammons. Let's see here. From William James. He says, as we know, the Great Migration will lead to many important contributions to not only World War I, but socially as well during the 1920s, particularly the Harlem Renaissance. However, the Great Depression then hits, and he asks, do you believe the Great Depression halted the possibility of the desegregation of the military just before World War II, or would it still have existed until post-World War II?
I probably should defer that question to Professor Jefferson. My answer would be that the Great Depression really didn't influence what happened to blacks in the military. They were dead set on not having blacks in combat positions. And in fact, it was pressure from black leaders and this whole Double V campaign that forced the United States military to actually sort of reconstitute the 92nd and 93rd Division, and then wouldn't let them train as a division.
Right, right. Yeah. You're absolutely right about that. The military during the 1930s were very reluctant to employ African Americans in their ranks. But they realized with the growing political presence of the black community in basically northern centers and the like, that they would have to accede, and they would have to basically do something about this. The black organizations and news weeklies during this time were asking the question, what is the place of African Americans in the military establishment? And that question became even more pressing as they were seeing the storm clouds of war basically start to gather in Europe. Basically, you had Pittsburgh Courier publisher Robert L. Vann, who was asking that question and started to lead a campaign basically asking for the creation of segregated divisions to be manned by basically black general officers. And they were looking at B.O. Davis Sr. as being the ideal person to lead that. The military establishment, and this time the Roosevelt administration, wanted to stay away from that as much as possible. It would take basically the exigencies of the 1940 presidential election for them to even contemplate that sort of thing to happen. So yeah, to make us long story short, the Great Depression had made no impression in the minds of military officials to do so, to include blacks in large numbers.
Thank you. Following up on that, Professor Jefferson, here's a question from Cale Carter II for you directly. He says, during World War II, there were 3 African-American divisions, the 93rd, the 92nd, and the 2nd Cavalry Division raised in 1943. I've read in the order of battle of the U.S. Army during World War II that there were plans to raise 2 more African-American divisions, the 105th and 107th Infantry Divisions. Do you know why the U.S. Army did not follow through with creating these divisions?
Well, that's a good question. The part of it was because basically those 2 divisions, the 92nd and 93rd Division, had already been deployed by the time they started to contemplate those 2 additional divisions as a part of its 100 division table of organization. They thought that, that those 2 divisions were going to be enough. You also have to remember the other thing about this is that the 2nd Cavalry Division was disbanded before they could be before they were being committed to basically the field of action. And when they were asked about why the 2nd Cavalry Division was disbanded, the Secretary of War at that time basically claimed that blacks could not basically master the modern basically weapons of warfare. And that brought a lot of criticism on the War Department altogether. So they were very reluctant to even devise, to bring those 2 divisions forward. But someone needs to study Like, what were the plans behind that? What were they going to be similar to the segregated divisions that were created basically during the early stages of the war? What would be the makeup of those divisions? And then also, what would be the criteria for selecting the officers who were going to serve in that unit?
Thanks. And let's follow up with a couple of more questions. These are from Facebook and about further African-American units in World War II. And I'd even preface this by saying there were lots of other units that I've just been exploring this myself. That surprised to me that it received practically no attention. For example, I think it was the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which also had a Medal of Honor recipient in it, and had very important service, as well as artillery units and others in Europe in World War II and other places that have just been totally overlooked. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done on this. But two questions on Facebook. One from Melinda wants to know more about the 761st Tank Battalion, which you did describe to some degree, but also comment on Facebook asks, do you have any information about the combat service of segregated Army units in the battles of Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge? I asked this question because my late father, who had been honorably discharged in Paris in 1946 as a Tech 4, saw combat in Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, supporting the 87th Infantry Division as part of Patton's Third Army. So could you just give a little overview of some of these units and their service?
These units, as I briefly outlined in my presentation, there's so much about World War II that has yet to be uncovered. These units basically happen to be like some of the unsung heroes of that Normandy, basically of that Normandy invasion. What happened, and I'm gonna talk about an example of how they basically been pretty much covered up. There have been films that have been made about the Normandy landing. Saving Private Ryan, for instance, basically really shows you exactly why. It shows you how basically the record has been whitewashed and how basically Black soldiers have been relegated to the realms of almost the oblivion. We need to know more about those units. The second question, let me answer the second question. There's a book that was written by David Colley titled basically Blood for Dignity, that looks at the integrated combat units of in the U.S. Army during World War II. That book basically gets at a lot of the dilemmas that the integrated Army faced at that time, and how the soldiers themselves, Black soldiers who served alongside their white counterparts, how they came to see it as being one in which they're also facing racism basically during the war, but they also earned grudging respect from their white counterparts on the field of battle. They thought they had been forgotten about. And it was only years later that they would go to these reunions and say, where were you guys? We were looking for you. That's the type of stories that need to be told at this particular moment, particularly since we see the numbers of World War II GIs basically dwindling daily. That's the thing that I want to leave with you, is that a lot of these stories have not been told. I think it's going to change the very complexion of what the war looked like, what it meant to so many different people. And I guess that's the way I would answer that question.
And Vernon Baker was the only one alive when those medals of honor were received or awarded. In what was that, 1997?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think one of the things that you note, and that's excellent, you recommended the perfect book, David Colley's Blood for Dignity. We need to keep in mind at all times that no Black soldier was ever allowed to command a white soldier. That was one of the stipulations which required rigid segregation. And so there were those 50, what they call fifth platoons of Black soldiers who were added to white companies, which normally had 4 platoons. There were over 50 of them who served starting during the Battle of the Bulge, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, 44 and 45. And they are actually attached to these white companies and do very well, as Colley points out, and gain the respect of their commanders. And once in combat with the white soldiers, they tended to get intermixed and fight for each other, which sort of is an indirect way of being integrated. But the point was that these were volunteers, and they all had to give up their rank so that they could not outrank their white counterparts.
That's right.
So when they came in as volunteers, and that was one of the keys. And I think, as Ed points out very correctly, you have these separate units, the 761st Tank Battalion, 614th. There are a couple of tank destroyer battalions, which are crucial. And then you have something like the 969th, which is an artillery battalion of 155 millimeter long tom guns, which plays a key role in the Battle of Bastogne to cover the 101st Division while it's there. And these men received a presidential unit citation shortly after the battle from General Maxwell Taylor, the commander of the 101st, because, as he pointed out, there was no way the paratroopers could have survived the onslaught of German panzers, armor, and so on without that heavy artillery. So Robert Jefferson is absolutely correct. The stories, Edward Carter is actually a tank rider in one of these spearhead battalions when he wins his Medal of Honor, as was Reuben Rivers, who was a sergeant tanker, but he was the spearhead man in the 761st before he was killed.
And many of these units took very heavy casualties there in the winter of 44-45. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I saw one reference, I believe it was in a personal account by a member of the 761st, that there were some cases of white soldiers being assigned to them as replacements during that period. Is that true? Did that happen?
That I'm not sure of.
I'm not sure as well.
It would be unusual because, okay, depending upon their rank, if they were officers, because usually they have a white captain. I cannot imagine a situation in which you put a white private in a unit like that, because he'd have black sergeants over him.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't want to click on this, but I don't know how many people have seen the movie Fury, starring Brad Pitt, which is probably the most recent movie about tankers, spearhead tankers. And in that movie, there is one black character, and he is the black lieutenant, infantry lieutenant, with the white captain. And I saw that and I thought, that didn't happen. There was no way you would have had a white unit, infantry unit, with a black lieutenant, which meant he could have given commands to those men underneath him. What was missing, and if they'd done their research, well, they would have understood that they needed to have a black platoon to go with the black officer. And so they wouldn't have this anomalous situation. I looked at it and I said, wonder where that black lieutenant came from. What is he doing there? Because that would have been one of those 50 platoons, 5th platoons that were integrated into those white infantry units.
You know, one of the I think one of the most profound perplexities and contradictions of the Second World War basically exists in the makeup of its officer corps. You know, that officer corps, the junior officers particularly, they basically attended officer candidate schools that were integrated. And I think that's a part of this story that we need to basically talk about. What happened at those OCS schools? What did they learn from that? And then also, how did they take what they learned from those schools into this segregated Jim Crow army that they found themselves in? I think that's another part of this story.
There's so many parts of the story that have been, as you say, probably overlooked is not the right word. Covered up is probably a better better term to use in many cases. Now, here's a question really for all of you, but particularly for Professor Morrow, because you have been through your career in addition to being a great scholar, you've been a mentor to your fellow scholars. And Cale Carter II asks, in addition to those on the panel, are there other historians, particularly young African-American historians, who are advocating for the preservation and education of stories involving African-American military service? Are the members of the panel willing to assist young African-Americans who wish to become military historians?
I cannot answer. Listen, first of all, I'm 76 years old. I don't know how much time I've got left. I actually have an African-American woman who's studying World War II here at the University of Georgia. I can't speak for my colleagues, but I'm certain they would be happy. I've actually produced a couple of African-American masters here that I've sent on to better schools who are now teaching. And I think that we welcome that. I've come in my time, I have run across a number of other folks. Adrian Lewis, who is a chaired professor at Kansas University of Kansas, is one of the very well-established military historians who himself actually served in the military in the Ranger Regiment and rose to the rank of major and taught at West Point before he came out and became a civilian professor. So there are others of us out there, but they're not that many. But I think that people would find we would be more than happy to have African-American students. There once was a time, and some people would kid me, they said, do you want to be the only one? And I laughed and said, hell no, that's really lonely. The more the merrier, the more Black historians we can get in this business, the better. And that's what we've done.
I think we've tried to demonstrate that the African-American military experience is essential. Studying it is essential to understanding the African-American historical experience writ large. And I think we've tried to show that, all this focus on slavery and Reconstruction and civil rights and, politics really it lies, if not excludes, this very important and essential element to the Black freedom struggle and to the quest for full citizenship. And we have people like Chad Williams and Adrian Lentz who actually kind of study not so much war, they look at these things through war. We say that we do both and look at these matters in a context of war. And, but in any event, there are, I think that what was once sort of a pariah subject, taboo subject, I think because of violence, I think because it sort of gestures toward an accommodation to the system when we talk about people who participate in the military, and especially the way World War I was represented in history. And we also have to understand how much pressure there was on Blacks to support that war effort, but they were not fighting for America as much as they were fighting for, equality for themselves. One thing that I left out that I think is important too, and it kind of relates to something that Robert just said about OCS, and that's the officer, the colored officer camps, training camp in World War I, and how, first of all, they didn't take the best and the brightest. They eliminated men from a certain age. Many of those college students who had started the campaign and wanted to be included were left out. And then they mistrained them for the assignments that they would have in war, and then of course blame them for their failures. But I thought it was important to let that be known that there were these camps, but once again, they were not playing ball fairly with blacks through them.
Thank you.
I just want to basically follow up with the question about being able to instruct younger scholars, basically thinking about military history in relation to the African-American experience. The military, what I've found is that when you study military history, it serves as a conduit for basically the social and cultural history of basically those who in society at a given moment. And I think when we look at it from that standpoint, the military is providing so much to American society and having people think about what it means to basically serve in the ranks and also to preserve those freedoms that we basically live under. And then also how it basically is translated in a broader fashion. I like to see more students of history in this regard, because when I first started, this is going back a ways, when we talked about the African-American military experience, it's always seen in the context of, it was always seen in a particular box of basically thinking about what basically black soldiers were forced to deal with and so forth, instead of thinking about how they remade basically the military institution altogether. That I like to see happen more and more as we go forward.
Thank you. One encouraging thing is how many great questions we've been getting, and I wish we could run this webinar, which has been fantastic, for another hour or two, because they keep coming. Maybe we'll do a follow-up. I think would be worthwhile. But I'll finish up with one comment, which is a nice comment, and then one short question for your final observations. The comment is from Peggy Gutierrez, who says, not a question, just a huge thank you. I plan on integrating more African-American history into my U.S. history course in Texas. Thanks to all. And I think that's one of the things we're all aspiring to. But also from Marty Evans, and I think this is important. He says, hope you'll provide similarly excellent coverage of Black women in war. And that applies both to World War I and World War II, as well as other conflicts. Are there any scholars who are working on that? Or any comments you have on that, any of you gentlemen?
I have a master's student, a young African-American woman who is very much interested in working on African-American wax in World War II for her master's, and its potential, if she chooses to go on for a doctoral dissertation. It could be a dissertation. And I think that what's interesting about this is that Jeff Sammons wrote me this morning and said, we should be discussing women too.
Yeah.
I had to say to him, Jeff, we don't have enough time, because he was thinking exactly along those lines. And there's so much to be done. We're realizing, in fact, there's a documentary done by a friend of mine, Gregory Cook, on African-American Rosie the Riveters in World War II, where he realizes there are hundreds of thousands of these women who actually broke into the service of the federal government, who were in the Army, who were actually code breaking in Washington. So I think one of the things that Professor Jefferson has emphasized is how much we don't know, that we're sort of at the beginning of this, and being of the generation where my uncles, my father-in-law served in the 92nd, and a number of their colleagues, because my father-in-law was a regimental surgeon and a major, a number of their colleagues stayed in the service and went on to rise to higher rank. And I was thinking about General Julius Beckton of the 93rd, who served in the Pacific in World War II as a young lieutenant. So in many ways, although this has been a very difficult period we've talked about, that a number of African Americans made excellent careers in the military at a time when civilian institutions were not really that open to their rise. And I think that's a worth of, as Professor Jefferson has been pointing us in that direction. I think it's worth it to keep that in mind.
You know, you mentioned General Beckton. I met him years ago when I was at officer training camp in Fort Knox. He came there and he basically gave the speech to us as basically graduated cadets. And I didn't realize that years later, I was going to basically be studying him for basically and writing about him in my first book. It's just how small the world is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm blanking. There's somebody who wrote about Black women in World War I. I'm blanking on her name. And then I just read something, not that, a few months ago, who's written about Black women in World War II.
Well, Brenda Moore has written on basically Black women.
Brenda Moore.
Yeah, right. And then Clarissa Threet, who she's written about basically Black women in the Women's Army Corps, but it was little later. Mm-hmm. So you're right. There is a dearth. Basically, we're at a moment where I think there should be basically a vast outpouring of basically dissertations and books written about women who served during this period.
Subject for a follow-up webinar. Gentlemen, thank you so much, Professor Morrow, Professor Sammons, Professor Jefferson. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I think it just points to how much more we need to study the subject and how much more there is to learn and to know and how important it is to all of us. So thank you again very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.